clear of Kanto.
Picture a Japanese soldier standing at the open door of a Philippine military aircraft. Below him, a small green island floats in the blue water of the Luzon Strait. He cannot see Taiwan from this height, but he knows it sits only 200 kilometers away. In a few seconds, he will jump. That moment has not happened yet, but it is scheduled to happen before the end of June 2026. Soldiers from Japan's Ground Self-Defense Force are set to take part in a parachute drop over Batan Island, the main island of the Philippine province of Batanes, later this month. It will take place under Kamandag, an annual military exercise between the Philippines and the United States that has grown bigger and more serious with every passing year, and which is already underway. For most of its history, Batanes was a quiet, windswept province known for stone houses, rolling hills, and rough seas that cut it off from the rest of the Philippines for months at a time. Fishermen and farmers, not generals, set the rhythm of life there. Nobody thought of it as a military hotspot. Today, it sits at one of the most closely watched points on the map of Asia. To understand why a province this small and this remote has become this important, we need to step back and look at the bigger picture. Because this story is about far more than one parachute jump. This year's Kamandag exercise, now underway, is its 10th running since the drill began in 2016. The name comes from a Tagalog phrase meaning cooperation of the warriors of the sea, and that cooperation has steadily grown wider with every passing year. More than 2,200 troops from the Philippines, the United States, Japan, and South Korea are taking part this time, with several more nations watching as observers. The exercise runs until July 1st, 2026. This is the 9th time Japanese forces have joined Kamandag, but something important has changed. In earlier years, Japan's role stayed close to home: search and rescue, disaster response, humanitarian aid. This time, Japanese paratroopers are scheduled to jump out of a Philippine aircraft onto Batan Island in a combat-style drill, training side by side with Filipino and American Marines, before the exercise wraps up on July 1. Philippine Marine Corps Brigadier General Bob Apostol explained the goal in plain language at the exercise's opening ceremony. The drill, he said, is meant to evaluate readiness to address any contingencies that could arise in the region. Translate that out of military speak, and the message is simple. These allies are rehearsing for a crisis they hope never comes, but one they are no longer willing to ignore. To understand why this matters, look at a map. Batanes lies about 200 kilometers south of Taiwan. Between the two sits the Bashi Channel, a strip of ocean that links the South China Sea to the open Pacific. Warships, submarines, fishing fleets, and cargo vessels moving between these two bodies of water often pass through this channel. It is one of the narrowest, busiest sea gates in East Asia. If a crisis ever broke out over Taiwan, the Bashi Channel would matter within hours, not weeks. Whoever can watch, control, or block this passage gains real influence over the movement of military forces, energy shipments, and trade. Taiwan's chip factories, which supply much of the world's advanced electronics, depend on shipping lanes that run close to these same waters. A blockage here would not just be a regional headache, it would ripple through global supply chains within days. The American writer and geopolitical analyst Robert Kaplan has long argued that geography rarely changes, even when governments and technology do. Mountains stay where they are. Channels stay open or closed depending on who controls the land around them. Batanes is becoming important today for the same reason it always had the potential to matter. It sits exactly where it sits, whether anyone pays attention to it or not. This is also why Batanes fits so neatly into the Philippines' wider defense thinking. Manila's military planners have spent recent years building what they call a layered, archipelago-wide defense posture, anchored in places like the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement sites. the contested Second Thomas Shoal, and now the northern islands facing Taiwan. Strategists who follow the realist tradition of thinkers like John Mearsheimer would recognize the pattern immediately. Small states sitting near great power fault lines survive by building coalitions, not by standing alone. Batanes is becoming one more pillar in that coalition-building effort. The Batanes exercise is not happening in isolation. It is one thread in a much larger pattern being woven across the region. For decades after the Cold War, security in Asia ran through separate bilateral relationships. The Philippines had its alliance with the United States. Japan had its own, separate alliance with the United States. These two relationships rarely overlapped. That picture is changing fast. In September 2025, the Reciprocal Access Agreement between Japan and the Philippines came into force. This agreement gives both countries a legal pathway to send troops onto each other's soil for training, something that used to require complicated, case-by-case arrangements. It is one of the clearest signs that Tokyo and Manila now see their defense futures as connected rather than separate. The scale of this year's exercises shows how far that cooperation has come.
We concurred that both sides will hold consultations when necessary to ensure the security of both countries and the peace and stability of the region. In particular, as unilateral attempts to change the status quo by force or coercion continue to be observed in the surrounding waters of our two countries.
Balikatan 2026, the largest U.S.-Philippines military exercise on record, brought together roughly 17,000 troops from 7 nations, including Japanese forces returning to Philippine soil for direct combat-related training. A historic step for a country that long avoided anything beyond disaster relief abroad. During that same exercise, American forces test-fired a Tomahawk cruise missile from a ground-based launcher that struck a target nearly 390 miles away. Japanese Type 88 missile units and Philippine BrahMos missile batteries trained together near the Luzon Strait, with authorities declaring a no-sail zone west of Batanes so the live drills could proceed safely. None of this happens by accident. Each exercise builds the shared habits, communication systems, and trust that Allied forces would actually need if a real crisis broke out. And each one adds to a growing list of sites, agreements, and access points, from enhanced defense cooperation agreement bases in northern Luzon to the new training grounds in Batanes, that quietly knit the region's defenses closer together. Of all the countries involved in this story, Japan's shift is the most striking. For most of the post-war era, Japan's constitution and political culture kept its military focused almost entirely on defending Japanese territory itself. Article 9 of that constitution renounced war as a tool of state policy, and for decades, sending troops abroad for anything beyond aid missions was politically sensitive and rare. That posture has been loosening for years, ever since Tokyo reinterpreted parts of its security law in the mid-2010s to allow closer cooperation with allies under certain conditions. The upcoming Batanes jump is simply the latest, most visible sign of how far that shift has traveled since then. Japanese forces are no longer just delivering relief supplies after typhoons. They are training for combat scenarios within sight of Taiwan's coastline. At the G7 summit in France this June, current Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi pushed fellow leaders toward closer coordination on the challenges posed by China, laying out Japan's view of the Indo-Pacific directly to the rest of the group. Her message was clear. Even if her words were diplomatic, Japan no longer sees itself as a bystander in regional security. It sees itself as a frontline state. For years, many analysts in Washington and Tokyo treated Taiwan and the South China Sea as two separate problems with two separate solutions. That separation is breaking down in real time. This year's Kamandag exercise is set to include training not only in Batanes, but also around Thitu Island in the Spratly Chain, hundreds of kilometers to the south, in the heart of the disputed West Philippine Sea, where an amphibious and airborne operation is planned to practice seizing an airfield. That single detail tells a much bigger story. Military planners are no longer treating these as unconnected hotspots scattered across the map. They are treating them as one continuous strategic space. The logic, once you walk through it, is straightforward. A war over Taiwan would disrupt shipping lanes across the entire South China Sea. A crisis in the South China Sea would complicate any military operation near Taiwan. The first island chain, stretching from Japan through Taiwan and the Philippines down into Southeast Asia, is turning into a single connected battle space rather than a string of separate trouble spots that can be handled one at a time. This shift matters even more once you remember what has already been happening near Second Thomas Shoal, where the grounded Philippine ship BRP Sierra Madre has become a flashpoint for years of confrontation with Chinese Coast Guard and militia vessels. That dispute used to be discussed almost entirely in South China Sea terms. Now it sits on the same strategic map as Batanes and the Bashi Channel, part of one connected picture rather than a side issue. None of this looks the same from Beijing's side of the map. From China's point of view, growing military cooperation between the Philippines, Japan, and the United States looks like an attempt to build a containment ring around its borders. Chinese officials regularly criticize what they call bloc politics and outside military involvement in what they consider their own neighborhood. This is not just rhetoric. In April 2026, after Japan criticized China's military exercises near Taiwan, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Guo Jiakun pushed back hard, accusing Tokyo of actions that blatantly violate the One China principle, and stating that Beijing had lodged formal protests with Japan over the matter. He urged Japan to honor its past commitments on the Taiwan question and stop what China considers interference in its internal affairs.
日本新型军国主义乘势为患，可能再次成为引发地区动荡的祸源。国际社会必须以史为鉴，高度警惕，共同遏制。
China's response to this widening alliance network rarely shows up only as words. Research groups that track Chinese activity in the South China Sea, including Washington-based think tanks that monitor satellite imagery of disputed reefs and islands, have documented years of steady island building, Coast Guard patrols, and what analysts often call gray zone tactics, pressure applied just below the threshold of open conflict. Expect the same pattern around Batanes. As Allied exercises grow larger and more frequent, China is likely to answer with its own patrols, drills, and statements, rather than simply absorbing the pressure quietly. This back and forth is a textbook example of what political scientists call a security dilemma. One side builds military cooperation to strengthen deterrence. The other side reads that same cooperation as a threat and answers with its own buildup. Both sides insist they are only defending themselves. Yet the overall temperature in the region keeps rising, year after year, exercise after exercise. Supporters of exercises like Kamandag make a fairly simple case. Armies that train together, share intelligence, and learn to operate side by side become harder to bully and harder to defeat. A well-prepared alliance, the argument goes, is less likely to be tested in the first place, because any potential attacker can see clearly what it would be up against. This is the same logic that has guided NATO thinking in Europe for decades, and it now appears to be guiding a much looser, more informal version of the same idea across the Indo-Pacific. Critics raise a different worry. Every new exercise near Taiwan, every fresh missile deployment, every new access agreement adds one more layer to a regional arms buildup that feeds on itself. Over time, this could create exactly the kind of mistrust and miscalculation that leads to the very war everyone insists they are trying to prevent. A single misread signal during a tense moment, they warn, could escalate faster than anyone intends. Both camps agree on one point. The stakes here are too high for guesswork. The real test for leaders in Manila, Tokyo, and Washington is not simply building military strength. It is building strength in a way that deters aggression without locking the region into a permanent, slow-motion cycle of confrontation. For the Philippines, Batanes is no longer a forgotten outpost at the edge of the map. It has quietly become one of the most strategically valuable pieces of land the country owns. This single province now sits at the meeting point of three major security stories at once: the defense of Taiwan, the dispute over the South China Sea, and the wider contest for influence across the Western Pacific. Manila's decision to open its northern islands to Allied training, missile deployments, and joint exercises reflects a deliberate strategic choice, not just an accident of geography. This is also why the Philippines' relationships with Japan and the United States matter so much right now. A small province sitting at a critical choke point carries more leverage than its size suggests, but it also carries more risk. Batanes gains attention, investment, and security backing from its position. It also becomes a place that any future crisis over Taiwan could touch directly and immediately. Filipino defense planners sometimes describe their broader approach as a porcupine strategy. A small or mid-sized nation cannot match a great power gun for gun, but it can make itself too costly, too well defended, and too well connected to attack easily. Opening Batanes to Allied training and missile deployments fits squarely into that thinking. It is not about the Philippines fighting China alone. It is about making sure the Philippines never has to. A single parachute jump over a small island will not by itself decide the future of Asia, but it is a visible piece of a much larger pattern that is quietly reshaping the region. Every joint exercise, every new defense agreement, and every missile deployment adds another thread to a growing security network stretching from Japan through Taiwan and the Philippines into Southeast Asia. The lines that used to separate these regional security stories from one another are fading fast. What happens in the Bashi Channel can no longer be separated from what happens in the South China Sea, or in the waters surrounding Taiwan itself. The question now is not whether this network keeps growing. It almost certainly will. The real question is whether it succeeds in deterring a war, or whether it becomes one more pressure pushing the region closer to the very conflict everyone claims they want to avoid. That answer will not come from a single headline or a single exercise. It will come from how China, Japan, the Philippines, and the United States manage this rising tide of military activity over the next few years. Soon, over Batan Island, a young soldier's parachute will open, and far below him, the future balance of power across the entire Indo-Pacific is quietly being written, one exercise at a time.